Hyojin. I'm a research associate at the Center for Sociological Research at KU Leuven. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this workshop. I'm actually learning a lot. All this insight is great. A pleasure for me to actually learn from all of you. I have to say that it is a big shame that I can't attend the workshop in person, and hopefully there will be a chance in the near future. So the research that I'm going to present today is actually quite different. It is very related, but a little different from the presentations that we've heard so far, because I'm trying to look at the potential consequences or the impact of family policy on, in a bigger picture, the gender inequality in the labor market across Europe. And it is actually a part of a bigger project that I've been conducting. So which is on how the labor market is gendered, meaning, how women are more likely to be in a more precarious state in the labor market, which I define as the labor market outsiders, and the role of family policy in shaping such gender patterns in the labor market. And as you can see, the presentation is based on the latter part of the project or the research. The findings are very connected, so I'll have to cover some of the findings from the previous chapters. So this could get a bit heavy, and hopefully that I can make it a bit clear. So just to say something that everyone is very well aware of, we've seen the increase in the women's employment rate over the last decade across Europe. Although the gap still exists, I would say this is still a very important achievement in terms of gender equality in the labor market. However, what have been another aspect that we have to consider, and it is quite important, is that women continue to be more likely to be in a low paid or atypical jobs, or in the jobs that have lack of prospects for advancement, which leads to their overrepresentation in the labor market outsiders, which I'll define later. With this in mind, the question that I had in a very simple way was, how then does family policy fit into this picture? How does family policies, are they associated with women's higher likelihood of being the labor market outsiders? So there has been an extensive literature on the impact of family policy on women's employment. So there are some intended outcomes, as we all know. So there has been increase in mothers' employment rate, reduced motherhood penalty, and although indirectly, the reduced statistical discrimination against women, which was led due to the changing gender norms. However, there were some unintended outcomes as well, which some studies have focused on, that we actually covered some of them already yesterday. One being that actually these outcomes may depend on the length or the duration of the effective or just leave, because so as yesterday we've discussed how the number isn't real. There is no agreement to this number exactly, but we just assume that there is that moderate length of leave, especially the parental leave, that leads to the most reduction in the motherhood penalty or the highest mother's employment rate. However, if the leave is too short or too long, then it may actually lead to mothers leaving the labor market entirely or staying unemployed even though they're still in the market. On the other hand, there is the literature on the welfare state paradox, which discusses how, so the term generous is it needs to be rethought, but anyway, so that there are some family policies that are more generous in terms of creating jobs for women. So the state as an employer, as they expand the care sector especially, they created jobs for women basically. However, these jobs were limited to the very female, so they ended up being a very female type jobs that is limited from reaching the top positions. But there was another study by Corby and the colleagues saying that actually, although these may not be the top jobs, these are not the bad jobs in the labor market, because they do still provide certain decent labor market working conditions. Then just to go back to what I was saying earlier, how then does the family policy impact women's relative likelihood of being the labor market outsiders? Does it mitigate it, as we can kind of think as an intended outcome? So does it reduce the gender gap, let's say, or does it enhance it paradoxically? So just to clarify some terminologies that I use here. So for the outsiders, so I use the insider-outsider theory or the labor market dualization theory. So it starts from the definition of insider being the protected core workers. So these are the workers who are often actually, although this is a limited definition, they're often defined as the standard workers in the labor market. So they enjoy this good income, the job security and the social protection, whereas the outsiders are the ones who who somehow deviate from the security that the insiders have. So they're in the periphery of the labor market. When I say the labor market is gendered, so I refer to specifically to women's overrepresentation in the outsider jobs or higher likelihood of being there. And also at the same time, the different outsider risks by women and men, however, with more emphasis on the former. So the research question was, how does family policy impact or shape the gendered labor market patterns? More specifically, do countries with more generous family policies show less women in the outsider jobs? I used two-level, multi-level random slopes modeling as a methodology, and random slopes for gender. And the data I've used at the individual level, I used European Working Conditions Survey 2015 from 30 different European countries, the EU 28, then EU 28, and also Norway and Switzerland. At the national level, I used the data from multi-links dataset, OECD family dataset, and Eurostat. And for the dependent variable is whether one is an outsider or not in the labor market. And this is actually defined through the definition of the outsider is actually derived from the latent class analysis that I've conducted earlier in the project. And how did I do that is that I use 5 indicators of labor market outsiders, that being part-time work, insecure employment, low income, subjective insecurity, and lack of job prospects. And I examined how they form different combinations and create different segments in the labor market, or to put it simply, the different types of jobs in the European labor market in a bigger picture. So what I found is, as you can see on the bottom side of the slide, so I found 4 different types of jobs, let's say, in the labor market, one being the insiders, so I label them insiders because they enjoy all the securities in the 5 indicators that I examined, but I found 3 different types of outsider jobs. So if we start from the very right-hand side of the slide, so I labeled this group typical outsiders because they share the characteristics of what we consider to be typically considered to be outsiders. So in there, they have insecure employment, they have low income, lack of prospects, but there are also groups. There is a group that I labeled dead-end insiders because they seem like an insider because they have secure employment, but then they actually have low income and lack of prospects. So these are actually the dead-end jobs that does have some sort of a permanent employment relationships. On the other hand, there is this group that I labeled subjective outsiders because they have secure employment, decent income, but for some reason, I'm still trying to figure it out. For some reason, they feel insecure about their employment. So I have 4 dependent variables in this research, one being whether one is an outsider or not, so whether one belongs to any of these outsider groups or not, and for the individual outsider jobs. For the independent variables, so as you can see, gender is a very important variable here. However, it is limited to the binary gender because of the limitation in the data. At the national level, so I categorize the variables into 3 groups, one being the family policy expenditure per GDP, the other one being work reducing family policy, also known as leave policies. And there I look at effective maternity, parental and paternity leave, which is calculated through multiplication of duration and the benefit level. I use the length of daddy quota, and also the total paid leave available for mothers and fathers separately. For the work facilitating family policy, public childcare services, I use the data that examines all or full-time coverage of the childcare services under the age of 3. I also account for quite a number of individual level variables, which include the individual characteristics such as age and education level, but also the family structure and also the workplace characteristics. So how is the labor market or the European labor market gendered? First of all, to discuss that first. So as you can see, roughly 70% of men are the insiders, whereas roughly 40% of women are the insiders. So as you can see, we can see a gap in the labor market, and women are quite a high number of women, a high proportion of women are actually the dead-end insiders, and the gap is quite big here, and women are also more likely to be the typical outsiders compared to men. And although the number is quite small, men are more likely to be the subjective outsiders compared to women. This is not covered in this particular research, but I just wanted to mention, so the typical outsiders are more likely to be the young workers in the labor market, and also the dead-end insiders are more likely to be the mid-aged or the mothers in the labor market, to just give you an idea of who they may be. So do these gender patterns vary across countries? And the answer is yes. So we still see women's higher likelihood of being outsiders compared to men. So women are still more likely to be the labor market outsiders wherever we look at. However, the extent differs. So the gender gap, to put it simply, differs. So if you look at the Austria at the very right-hand side, then women are 2.6 times more likely than men to be outsiders compared to men. And if you compare it to the Portugal, the gap is quite big. But if we look at different types of outsiders, so if we break it down to different types of outsiders, the pattern actually changes. So I don't know if you've noticed, but the order of the countries actually have changed, and the cross-national variation is actually not as prominent as it is for the general outsiders that we've seen earlier. However, this cross-national variations and the gender gap is more pronounced if you focus on the dead and insiders, because as you can see, again, the Austria at the very right-hand side, the women are 5.5 times more likely to be the dead and insiders compared to women. Germany, 4.3. These are really big. And this is not part of this research necessarily, but if you can see, the countries that belong to the right-hand side of this figure are the countries that are usually considered to be the conservative welfare state. So for the subjective outsiders, as you can see, men are more likely to be the subjective outsiders compared to women across Europe. The gender gap still varies, although to a smaller extent, but it still varies across countries. So why do we then see these cross-national variations? And does the family policy have a role in that? Was the question that I wanted to explore in this research. So I am still very cautious of using the genders after listening to the lecture yesterday, but the question here I wanted to ask was, do countries with more generous family policies show less women in the outsider jobs? That would be the intended outcome to some extent, right? However, the answer is no, because as you can see on the first figure here, the countries with the bigger family policy expenditure tends to have more women in the outsider jobs compared to men, and the gap is larger, which is, I believe, is led by the increase of the dead and insiders in these countries. The subjective outsiders do decrease, but as you remember, they're a very small group in the bigger labor market. So how about the leave policies? When we look at the leave policies, the significant result was found for the effective parental leave. So the length of the effective parental leave did matter, but the countries with the moderate length of leave actually showed the highest likelihood of women being the outsiders compared to men, which is quite similar to the picture that we see for the dead and insiders, but not for the other groups. However, the picture was slightly different if you look at the different outsider groups. So for the typical outsiders, with the longer parental leave and also the paternity leave, we see the decrease in women's likelihood of being outsiders. The typical outsiders, these are usually the temporary workers, temporary low-end workers. And also if we see here on the right-hand side, with the longer effective parental and paternity leave, we do see the decrease in gender gap, but we actually see the increase of women in the subjective outsiders, which is something that actually needs to be further explored. So just to sum up and also to share some of my interpretations of these results. So what we can infer from these findings is that the generous family policy has been associated with women's higher likelihood of outsiders, not lower, but higher likelihood of being outsiders. And what was quite interesting is that if you remember the literature that we discussed earlier, so the countries with the moderate length of leave, we tend to think that these countries are actually better off because we see more women employed or more mothers employed, and we see less motherhood penalty. But actually, in reality, these are the countries where we see more dead-end jobs. So from that, we can infer that actually mothers may stay in or return to the labor market in these countries with the moderate length of leave, but they may actually end up being in the dead-end jobs, not the insider jobs. And also, actually, for the childcare services, there were no significant results. which I think could be due to the limited variables that I've used, but we will have to explore that in the future. For the other results, there were some findings as you've seen, but these actually, I might need some help from you actually, because I have some ideas, but I'm not sure to what extent I can be sure of these interpretations. So I found that the longer effective parental or paternity leave actually leads to less typical outsiders, especially amongst women. And my interpretation so far is that they're instead of getting any jobs, they might actually choose, or choice is a very difficult term to use. They maybe just end up getting into the dead-end jobs that are seemingly secure, but it's not actually for progression. But then they still don't end up being in a very, I guess, the most precarious state in the labor market. But at the same time, these countries may actually have just less typical outsider jobs, which is not necessarily linked to the family policy. Or if you remember, the typical outsiders are more likely to be the young workers. So that the decrease in the gender gap could be that with the increase in parental and paternity leave, we may have seen the changing gender norms and reduced statistical discrimination, especially for the paternity leave. On the other hand, the longer effective in parental and paternity leave led to actually surprisingly more subjective insecurity for women, which could be due to the career breaks due to the longer leave or the stigmatization around it, which will have to be explored further. And I would love to hear more about how you think. So what do these mean? And some of the questions I had after this research was, are these really unintended? And if that sounds too, conspiracy theory, then is it really unexpected, these results? Because considering how these policies are actually not necessarily disrupting the gender norms, are these really unexpected results? And where are we heading? So the findings in this research, I would say, was showing, so the implications that we can have from this is that family policy is indeed important. I'm not trying to say that it's leading to bad jobs for women, we have to get rid of it, but actually that's not true. It is very important. It helps women to stay in the labor market, but we actually need to think about what types of jobs that they're getting into and the quality of the jobs, not just the quantity of the number, quantity-wise, or the number of women in the labor market. Because at the end of the day, the jobs that they end up having, especially the mothers who return to the labor market, may be limited to the dead-end jobs. And they may be the only option actually for the work for someone to balance between work and family. As I mentioned earlier, the policies that do not disrupt the existing gender norms may actually not paradoxically, but it may actually in turn enhance the existing gender norms and work as part of the system. So some of the policy recommendations that I had from this is that we actually need the policies that can change the existing norms. So not just pushing women into the labor market, just doing that, but we need to think about how to actually change the gender norms. That's something that we've discussed so far, right? And we definitely need, although the findings are very limited here, we definitely more increased fathers' role in care, and also to make the work-family balance a norm by perhaps introducing shorter working hours, and instead of going towards adult worker model, adult care model. And also this is a family policy workshop, but I actually echoed the last slide that we saw earlier today, how we actually also need to think about the labor market policies together with the family policy, because so in the EU directives, when we think about the gender equality policies, they are very much focused on the family policies and mothers balancing between work and family, not fathers too. So but then what it misses out is not just the fact that fathers also need to balance work and family, but also that it's not just the motherhood that increases women's relative outsiderness in the labor market, let's say. And we have to think about how the jobs that are available for women and the jobs that are considered feminine are actually quite devalued, and they may not be as good of a job in reality in the labor market. So I think that's it for the presentation today, and I look forward to all the comments and questions. Thank you very much.